I never told my son what I kept locked inside the old workshop behind my house. For 31 years, that building sat at the edge of my property like a quiet promise I'd made to myself and to his mother. My son knew I went in there sometimes. He'd seen the light through the small window on winter evenings. But he never asked what I did inside, and I never offered to explain. That was fine by me. Some things are better kept between a man and the walls he built with his own hands. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I live in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and I spent 37 years building a furniture restoration business from nothing but a pickup truck and a set of hand tools I inherited from my father. I restored antique pieces, chairs, cabinets, writing desks, wardrobes, things people had given up on. I brought them back. That was my life's work, and I was proud of it. I still am. My wife Carol died 9 years ago, ovarian cancer. She was 58, and she did not deserve any of it. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the neighborhood, who kept a spare key for the elderly widow 2 streets over in case she ever got locked out, who taught my son to say thank you without being prompted, even when he was only 4 years old. When she died, something in the house went quiet in a way I still haven't gotten used to. The workshop became the place I went when the quiet got too heavy. My son's name is Daniel. He is 35 now. For the first 26 years of his life, he was the boy his mother raised, thoughtful, a little stubborn, but honest in the way that mattered. Then he met Vanessa. I want to be fair here, because I believe in being fair even when it costs me something. Vanessa is attractive, well-spoken, and she can be charming in a way that feels completely genuine until the moment you realize it has never once been directed at you without a reason attached to it. She grew up in Charlotte, studied marketing for 2 years before dropping out, and had been through 2 serious relationships before Daniel that both ended according to her because the men couldn't handle an ambitious woman. I heard that explanation twice, before I stopped asking questions and started paying closer attention instead. Daniel married her 3 years after they met. I stood at the front of that church in the blue suit Carol had helped me pick out for his college graduation, and I smiled, because my son was happy. And that mattered more than the feeling I couldn't quite name that had been sitting in my chest for the past year. I told myself I was being a difficult old man. I told myself Carol would have told me to let it go. Maybe she would have. I don't know. She was wiser than me about most things. The questions started about 4 months into the marriage. Not big questions. Small ones, asked in a casual tone that was designed to sound like they didn't matter. Vanessa came by one Sunday afternoon while Daniel was out running errands, and I was sanding down a Victorian side table on the back porch. She brought lemon cake, which was considerate, and we sat at the porch table, and she asked how business had been. I told her it was steady. She nodded and asked if I'd ever thought about expanding, maybe hiring, taking on bigger commissions. I said I liked working alone. She smiled and said that made sense, then looked out at the property and said, almost to herself, that it was a beautiful piece of land, that lots this size, so close to Asheville, were going for serious money these days. I said that was interesting and offered her another slice of cake. Over the following months, the questions kept coming, always wrapped in the same pleasant, offhand packaging. What did I think the workshop was worth as a separate structure? Had I updated my homeowner's insurance recently? She had a friend in insurance if I needed a referral. Was I planning to keep running the business myself indefinitely? Or was there a point at which I'd think about selling the name and the client list? Did I have a financial advisor? A will? That last one came from Daniel directly, not Vanessa, which was the part that stayed with me longest. We were having dinner at their house, a nice house in a neighborhood that I knew cost more than Daniel's salary. As a project manager could comfortably support, and he asked me over the pasta whether I'd gotten around to updating my estate documents since his mother passed. I told him I had things in order. He nodded and said Vanessa had mentioned that it was something I might want to revisit, just to make sure everything was structured in a tax-efficient way. He used the phrase tax-efficient. My son, who used to call me from college because he couldn't figure out his own tax return, was now using the phrase tax-efficient at the dinner table. I drove home that night and sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. I did not panic. I am not a man who panics. What I did was think, carefully and slowly, the way I work on a piece of furniture that's been damaged in ways that aren't immediately visible. You have to look at the whole thing before you start. You have to understand what you're dealing with before you touch anything. What I was dealing with was this. My son's wife had decided that my assets, the house, the land, the workshop, the business, the savings Carol and I had built over 4 decades were a resource to be managed. And she was managing my son's relationship with me the same way she would manage any other resource, carefully, patiently, with a long-term strategy. The part that hurt was not Vanessa. I had no illusions about Vanessa. The part that hurt was Daniel. My son was letting it happen. Whether he fully understood what was happening or whether she'd constructed a version of events in which he genuinely believed he was just looking out for his old man, I wasn't sure yet. But he was letting it happen, and that was something I had to sit with. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my legal affairs for 18 years. I told her I wanted to review everything, the will, the property documents, the business ownership structure, all of it. I also told her I wanted those documents stored securely at her office, with no copies kept at my house. She asked if everything was all right. I told her it was, and that I was just being careful. She said that sounded like me. 3 weeks later, after Patricia and I had finished restructuring things in a way I'll explain shortly, I made another call. This one was to a private investigator named Roy, who had been recommended to me by a retired sheriff's deputy I knew from church. I told Roy what I'd observed and what I suspected. I told him I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I just wanted to understand what I was dealing with. He told me his rate and said he'd be in touch. Roy was thorough and discreet. Over the next 2 months, he gave me a picture that was clearer and more uncomfortable than even I had expected. Vanessa had significant credit card debt from before the marriage that Daniel knew nothing about. She had also, in the 14 months since the wedding, opened 2 credit accounts in Daniel's name, without his knowledge, a detail that Roy confirmed, through sources I didn't ask him to elaborate on. She had been having regular lunches with a man named Greg, who turned out to be a real estate investor she'd known since her time in Charlotte. Roy described their meetings as professional in nature, but noted that they occurred consistently on days when Daniel was traveling for work, and that she paid for them in cash. I read Roy's report 3 times. Then I put it in a folder and drove it to Patricia's office. Here is the thing about being 64 years old and having spent your life working with your hands. You learn that the worst thing you can do to a damaged piece of furniture is rush the repair. You strip something down too fast. You splinter the wood. You apply pressure before the joint is ready. You crack it permanently. The damage that looks minor on the outside is sometimes the damage that goes all the way through. You have to be patient. You have to wait for the right moment. I waited. I kept having Sunday dinners with Daniel and Vanessa. I kept accepting the lemon cake. I kept answering questions about the business in ways that were truthful but incomplete, the way a man does when he's decided to let the other person keep believing they know more than they do. Vanessa began to relax around me. I could see it, the slight softening of the performance, the moments when the questions became more direct because she'd decided I was manageable. That was fine. I needed her to feel comfortable. In the meantime, I made a series of quiet changes. The workshop, which Vanessa had, on 2 separate occasions, referred to as the most valuable structure on the property, and which she had once asked, in a voice dripping with casual interest, whether I'd ever considered converting into a rental unit. The workshop became something different than what she thought it was. Here is what Vanessa believed the workshop contained: decades of tools, antique furniture in various states of restoration, and probably, she seemed to assume, some amount of cash or valuables that a man of my generation might prefer to keep at home rather than in a bank. Here is what the workshop actually contained, after my quiet restructuring: tools, furniture, and a very ordinary metal filing cabinet full of documents that were entirely mundane: insurance records, old invoices, a collection of hand-drawn sketches Carol had made of furniture pieces she wanted us to restore someday, the kind of paperwork that would take a long time to go through and yield absolutely nothing of value. Everything else, the investment accounts, the updated will, the property trust documents, the records of the business valuation, the folder from Roy, all of it was at Patricia's office, organized, clearly labeled, and completely inaccessible to anyone who was not me. I also made one additional change that I want to describe carefully, because it is the part of this story I am most proud of, and also the part that still makes me sad. I created a trust. Patricia helped me structure it so that the bulk of my estate, the house, the land, the business would not pass directly to Daniel upon my death, but would instead be managed by a trustee for a period of 5 years, during which time Daniel could access income from it, but could not sell or liquidate any assets. At the end of 5 years, full control would transfer to him. The 5-year window was not punitive. It was protective. If Daniel was still married to Vanessa at the time of my death, the structure meant she could not pressure him into a quick sale. If he wasn't, it gave him time to be steady on his own feet before he had to make any major decisions. I had not told Daniel any of this. That was intentional. The dinner happened on the second Saturday of October, about 8 months after I'd first called Patricia. I invited Daniel and Vanessa to the house for what I described as a proper meal. I cooked the pot roast Carol used to make on Sundays, a recipe I'd spent 2 years learning to replicate after she passed, and had never served to anyone outside this house. That detail mattered to me. They arrived at 6. Vanessa wore a cream-colored blouse, and the expression she used when she'd decided an occasion was significant. She helped set the table and asked twice about the workshop light, which she could see through the kitchen window. I told her I'd left it on by accident, and I'd get it later. I watched her eyes move to the workshop and back. We ate. We talked. Daniel told me about a project at work. Vanessa talked about a neighborhood in Asheville where home values had increased 20% in 3 years, and how it was remarkable, and how the whole region was really changing. I agreed that it was remarkable. I poured more wine. After dinner, when we were sitting with coffee, I told them I had something I wanted to share. Vanessa set down her cup. I noticed her straighten slightly. I told them I had been doing some thinking about the future, and that I had recently finished updating my estate planning. I said that I'd worked with my attorney. I used Patricia's full name and the name of her firm, and that everything was in order and stored securely at her office. I said this in a tone that was entirely pleasant. I watched Vanessa's face carefully. Then I said I wanted to tell Daniel specifically that I had structured things in a way I thought was fair and thoughtful, and that Patricia had all the details, and that when the time came, Daniel should contact her directly. I said the documents were not at the house. I'd decided some time ago that keeping sensitive paperwork at home wasn't sensible, and Patricia had agreed. The pause that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Vanessa asked, still pleasantly, whether I'd had a chance to get an updated appraisal on the workshop and the land, since values had changed so much. I told her I had, and that the appraisal was also on file at Patricia's office. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, because all the attention is somewhere behind them. Daniel looked at me, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something in my son's face that I hadn't seen in over 2 years. A kind of stillness. The look a person gets when something has caught up to them. I didn't press it. I just held his gaze and gave him a small nod, the way I used to when he was a boy, and he'd done something that required honesty, and he was deciding whether to go through with it. 2 weeks later, Daniel called me on a Tuesday night. Vanessa was at a work event, he said. He asked if he could come by. I said of course. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd done homework as a child, and he told me that he'd found something on his phone, a message between Vanessa and a man named Greg that he hadn't been able to explain away. He said he'd gone back and looked at things and found the credit accounts. He said his voice was steady, but he was gripping his coffee mug like he needed something to hold on to. I listened. I did not say I already knew. There is a version of that conversation where I could have pulled out Roy's folder and laid everything on the table and been proven comprehensively right. But that version of the conversation was not the one my son needed. My son needed to feel like he had found his own way to the truth, because that was the only way the truth would stick. When he finished, I told him I was sorry. I told him that I loved him. I told him that whatever he decided to do, I would be there. He asked me if I'd known. I told him I had suspected, and that I had made sure that whatever happened, we would both be protected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you do, Dad?" I told him about Roy. I told him about Patricia and the trust. I told him about the restructuring and the documents that weren't in the workshop, and the 5-year window I'd built in, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted to give him time to breathe. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I told him the truth. I said I needed to be sure first. I said I needed to make sure that when I gave him the information, I was giving him something solid, not just a feeling. I said I'd also needed to make sure that if things went sideways before he was ready to see it, everything was already protected. I told him that was what a father does. You don't always announce the net before someone falls. Sometimes you just make sure it's there. He put his face in his hands, not crying exactly, just the posture of a man processing something heavy. I got up and put my hand on his shoulder the way I had when he was small, and the world had hurt him in one of its ordinary ways, and I told him it was going to be all right. Not because everything was fine, it wasn't, but because he was a good man, and good men get through hard things. He filed for divorce 4 months later. It was not easy, and it was not clean, but Patricia had recommended a colleague of hers who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, and the credit accounts that Vanessa had opened in Daniel's name turned out to be a significant factor in how the proceedings went. Vanessa's attorney pushed twice on the question of my assets, and both times Patricia's structure held exactly as designed. There was nothing to push on. Everything was in trust, everything was documented, and none of it was accessible in the way Vanessa had been planning for. I am not a vindictive man, I want to say that clearly. I did not build any of this because I wanted to punish anyone. I built it because I had worked for 37 years alongside my wife to make something solid, and I was not willing to let that work be dismantled by someone who saw it as nothing more than an opportunity. Carol's memory is in this house. It is in the workshop, in the tools, in the furniture I restore because she taught me that broken things deserve patience. I was not going to let that go. Daniel is living in a rental apartment in Asheville now, about 12 minutes from my house. He comes over most Sundays. Sometimes he helps me in the workshop. He was never interested when he was young, but something has shifted in him, and lately he stays for 2 or 3 hours, learning the work slowly the way you're supposed to learn it. He asked me recently what was in the old filing cabinet in the corner, the one I'd left in place after reorganizing everything else. I told him it was his mother's furniture sketches and some old invoices, and nothing of any particular importance. He nodded and went back to sanding the chair leg I'd asked him to work on. We were quiet for a while, and it was the good kind of quiet. The kind Carol used to say was the sign that two people were comfortable enough with each other not to need to fill the space. I thought about her. I thought about the 31 years she and I had spent building everything I'd almost watched come undone. I thought about Daniel at 7 years old in this same workshop, sitting on the stool in the corner, eating a sandwich, and asking me questions about how wood grain worked, why some pieces were worth saving and others weren't. Everything worth saving has a grain, I used to tell him. You have to work with it, not against it. The grain tells you where the strength is. I set down my tool and looked at my son, and I thought, there he is. There's the grain. Still there, same as it always was, under everything that had been layered on top of it. Patient work and time, and it comes back. It always comes back. The workshop light was still on when we finally locked up that evening. I could see it from the back steps as I watched Daniel walk to his car, and he turned once and raised a hand, and I raised mine back. The light stayed on a little while after he left. I didn't rush to turn it off. Some things are worth leaving lit.